Well, this time I'm going to do this slightly differently. I'm going to read you an article I wrote many years ago for something called Le Trait d'Union, which was a newspaper published by the Union des Français en Grande-Bretagne, the French Union of French People in Great Britain. Right, so I'm just going to read you this for about 7 minutes or so to put you in the picture, and then we will go on to the lecture. So Madame de la Tour du Pin, French Emigrés in Richmond after 1789, it's through her book that I discovered that it inspired me to make this lecture, about 25 years ago, which I first delivered to the Cercle Français de Richmond, of all places. French émigrés in Richmond. During the French Revolution, many members of the aristocracy left France to take refuge in England. About 50 of the noblest of them settled in Richmond and Twickenham, two towns that form the present municipality of Richmond-on-Thames, and which even in the 18th century were less than an hour from the centre of London. At the time, George III resided at Kew Palace, which, with its magnificent park stretching along the Thames, where now are to be found the famous botanical gardens. His children, their wives, or their mistresses resided in Richmond, Petersham, or Twickenham, in the fine houses which still exist today. Some of these French aristocrats were related to the British nobility. This was the case of La Marquise de la Tour du Pin, born Henriette Dillon, niece of the Princess d'Hénin, and also of a lady called Lady Frances Jerningham, who was part of the Lichfield family, and she was a cousin of Lord Lichfield. In her memoir, she describes the lives of these émigrés in Richmond at the end of the 18th and early 19th century. The archives of the Richmond Municipal Library also give us an insight into the life of many of these émigrés, often as poor as Madame de la Tour du Pin, but refusing to accept the charity offered to them by the British government. These grants requested for them by the English aristocrats of Richmond had moreover been condemned by the local shopkeepers. Other émigrés were, however, quite well off, as in fact was La Princesse d'Hénin and her old friend Lally Tollendal, who lived in a comfortable house in the centre of Richmond, the Rosary, had financial resources sufficient enough to allow them to rent a second residence in the country, Juniper Hall at Mickleham, near Box Hill in Surrey. The princess would invite a number of other prominent refugees there, known as the constitutionnels, the constitutionalists, or les monarchistes constitutionnels, among whom were Talleyrand, Madame de Staël, Monsieur de Narbonne, Madame de Lauzon, and the Princesse de Bouillon, who was born Princess of Hesse-Rotenburg, who also took refuge in Richmond. Another of her coterie, the Princesse de Poix, was unable to leave France, unlike her husband, the Prince de Poix, who was another of the French exiles of Richmond. The Prince de Poix, divorced by his wife, was a member of the important Noailles family. This gentleman, a former governor of Versailles, often went to fetch Madame de la Tour du Pin in Teddington, a small town next to Twickenham, at the home of La Duchesse de Duras in Tilbury, a light open two-seater carriage. She used to go there on foot, walking along the banks of the Thames, but preferred to return in the carriage of the Prince de Poix. The Marquise de la Tour du Pin was indubitably the most fascinating of all these exiles living in Richmond. After fleeing from Bordeaux in 1790 with her husband and her newborn child, this brave lady had suffered many difficulties before her arrival in Richmond in 1792. She had crossed the Atlantic in a small American ship and had bought a farm near Albany, the capital of New York State. Although from the highest Franco-Irish nobility, and at one time had been a lady waiting to Queen Marie Antoinette, she did not hesitate to work there as a peasant. She thus made a great impression on Talleyrand during his visit to the farm. Being a little cramped in the two rooms on the ground floor that her aunt, La Princesse d'Hénin, had put at her disposal, and that of her family, she rented a little house on the green next to the main gate of the former Tudor Palace of Richmond, as she says, in a fairly remote part of the town. Unfortunately, on the very day she moved into her new home, she lost her third child, who had been born earlier in Richmond. One of her neighbors was le Marquis de Thuisy, a knight of Malta who resided there with his respectable family in the neighboring house, the Old Courthouse, a large house built at the end of the 18th century. The Marquis de Thuisy was reputed to be the savior of all the émigré ladies of Richmond. He not only looked after their business affairs, but he also sought work for the ladies of his acquaintance. As most of them preferred to stay at home, he had found them the opportunity to do the laundry of certain of the well-to-do families of the town. To Madame de la Tour du Pin, he entrusted the marking of the laundry because it was in this kind of work that she excelled, embroidery. Horace Walpole, the distinguished man of letters of the period, who was in correspondence with George Selwyn, a man who was rather a rake, member of the Hellfire Club, was well acquainted with these ladies and considered the Marquise de Boufflers to be their queen. She lived on the green in Cedar Grove House, Richmond Green, of course, put at her disposal by the Russian ambassador, Count Vorontsov, whose daughter married into the Herbert family, who were the Earls of Carnarvon. The niece of the Comte de Boufflers, the Vicomtesse de Cambis, née Louise Princesse d'Alsace-Chimay, arrived in Richmond in 1789 and was buried there in 1809. Anne de Caumont de la Force, Comtesse de Balby, moved to Wick House, a large house built for Sir Joshua Reynolds, painter and founder of the Royal Academy. She had left France with her lover, the Comte de Provence, future King Louis XVIII. Their affair lasted until 1794, when she left him for Archambault de Périgord, who was related, of course, to Talleyrand. Among other famous émigrés who stayed in Richmond were Chateaubriand, who made a brief sojourn in 1799, and apparently he used to like to go swimming in the river and going for long walks in Richmond Park. He was only here for a short time. And Madame de Staël, who spent almost a year with her last lover and future husband, the young Comte Albert Jean de Rocca, in the beautiful Gothic house by the Thames from June 1813 till May 1814. At least 20 of these émigrés are buried in the Richmond Parish Burial Ground, the Vineyard Passage, of whom the most famous was, without doubt, Jacques Mallet du Pin, philosopher, journalist, and historian of Swiss origin. Now we start. So, I hope that gave you an idea of what this is all about. Was that a good idea, do you think, Alan, to start off with that? Puts it into perspective, don't you think?
Yes, yes.
Good. Right, so La Comtesse de Balby, well, she was the mistress of the Comte de Provence, that's Louis XVIII. And they first lived in the Wick, Richmond Hill, which of course I explained what that was, didn't I? That it was built by Joshua Reynolds. It's still there. Many of you will know that that's where John Mills lived. And in fact, Pete Townsend owns it at the moment, and various other people. It's that very, very beautiful house on the top of Richmond Hill, actually, which is by Nightingale Lane, that very steep lane that runs from the bottom of Richmond Hill to the top by the Petersham Hotel. So there's the Comtesse de Balby. She actually had 2 children by the Comte de Provence, Louis XVIII. They actually were quite a promiscuous lot of people, I must say. And they all seem to be related, and you'll find that many of them were cousins of each other, which was a common practice. It's basically to keep the money in the family. Well, of course, the Windsors weren't bad at doing that either when they were the Saxe-Coburg-Gothas. Now, as I told you, Horace Walpole and his friend George Selwyn were very, very impressed by la Comtesse de Boufflers and her daughter, la Duchesse de Biron. If you ever go to Paris, the Hôtel de Biron, which is in fact the Rodin Museum, was their beautiful home in Paris. Unfortunately, Monsieur le Duc de Biron, he unfortunately lost his head in 1793, and his wife went back too early and she lost hers in 1794. This was during the Terreur of Robespierre. Now there's Horace there, and Horace at his house, Strawberry Hill, he had a printing press, and he invited Madame the Comtesse de Boufflers to go to Strawberry Hill from the house where she lived, Cedar Grove, Richmond Green. Tell you more about that in a minute. And she was very fascinated to see the printing press that he had. And on the printing press, there was this little poem dedicated to her, which he printed off and gave her. The graceful fair who loves to know, nor dreads the north's inclement snow, who bids her polished accent wear the British diction's harsher air, shall read her praise in every clime where types can speak or poets rhyme. Anyway, the place that she lived in is very interesting. If you know Richmond Green, I'm only saying a lot of this explanation for people who don't live in Richmond. In other words, many of our foreign guests. Richmond Green, of course, by Richmond Palace. Richmond Palace was built for Henry VII, and it's because of Henry VII coming to Richmond in late 1400s, that it's called Richmond, because he was the Duke of Richmond in Yorkshire. So that's why it was originally called Sheen. And the original Sheen Palace was situated somewhere in Kew Gardens, where in fact now we have Kew Palace and the hothouses there. And that Richard II was there. In fact, Richard II's wife died there in Sheen. So already we had palaces outside London, and they always had to keep changing their domiciles because they had problems with their sewers, shall we say. Anyway, it's rather an interesting building. It's called Cedar Grove. It's now called the Virginals. Whoever bought it changed the name in 1961. It's on the corner of Richmond Green, and it's Old Palace Lane, which goes down to the river. I think if you know Richmond Green, it's in that corner on the far side, going past the pub called the Swan. The building that you see there is the old Richmond Theatre, where they used to go, obviously, because it was still operating as a theatre until quite late on, where you would have performances by Garrick, and Edmund Kean used to be there as well. In fact, Edmund Kean ran the theatre for some time. So a very important place. That wasn't pulled down until quite late. So that's the original Richmond Theatre, and that is why the little place by trumpeters is called Garrick Close, after David Garrick, because that was the site of the old theatre. Now, this is Henriette Dillon, Marquise de la Tour du Pin. I explained some of the what happened to her. They left France during the Revolution, and they went very rapidly from Bordeaux to America, where she ended up in 1790. Her husband was another aristocrat, obviously Marquis de la Tour du Pin, and he was fleeing for his life like she was. And her father, Viscount Arthur Dillon, was the grandson of the Earl of Lichfield and brother of Lady Frances Jerningham. He was executed as a royalist in 1794. He actually was he actually inherited his own army, and they were part of the French army. And he was they were French Irishmen. And as a matter of fact, one of his regiments fought in the Battle of the Boyne on the side of James II. So that's Arthur Dillon. It originally is a Plantagenet name. Dillon is de Lyon. There's the connection. Very sad about him dying or being executed. Now, that's the Princess d'Hénin. Well, she divorced her husband, and he was another person who was executed. And she came with her lover, whose name was Gérard Lally Tollendal, an interesting man of Irish extraction as well, French-Irish, another one of the French-Irish connection. And he was, according to my sources, a long line of bastards. In other words, illegitimate children. They all were apparently in his family. And his father has the notoriety of being the French general when India was lost to the English. In fact, he lost Pondicherry. Carol, you need to mute yourself. He lost Pondicherry. No, you haven't.
I am muted.
Well, I can hear you. That's it. Anyway, he lost Pondicherry to the British, and in fact, he was executed, although there were various people who said he shouldn't have been because it wasn't completely his fault. So Gérard Lally Tollendal, who was amongst all these other people you will see, what Madame la Marquise de la Tour du Pin called les philosophes. Now, Lally Tollendal never stopped talking, apparently, and he was a great exponent of what they were after. Really, was what we had. They were all what was called Angloman. They were all maniacal English lovers, because what they all wanted was a constitutional monarchy. Won't go into the whole of the history of France because it's very difficult, but there we are. And the other man who lived in this house, which you'll see in a minute, is called Jacques Mallet Dupont. It's very interesting because one of our great historians, whose name was Mr. Cloke, John Cloke, he wrote an awful lot of these books about Richmond. And it was in fact in his books that I first got my interest in the French aristocrats in Richmond. And he actually owned the Rosary. Now, after his death, it was sold. This is the house. Here we are. It's a semi-detached house, but quite big. You probably know it, most of you. It's in the Ormond Road, the Rosary. And it was sold for 1.8 million in 2012. It's on the market now for 3 million. Anyway, that's prices rising. Well, anyway, Madame de la Tour du Pin and her family lived on the ground floor. It is a very beautiful house. And but she got rather fed up with hearing Lally going on and on and on about his politics. Well, as I told you, they actually managed to rent a place in 1792 to 1793. All of these people about whom I've spoken, decamped to Juniper Hall, Mickleham, Surrey, which, if you know, Box Hill is at the bottom. And amongst them were Louis Comte de Narbonne-Lara, Germaine de Stael, née Necker, and of course the famous Charles Maurice de Talleyrand Périgord. It would be a 3-hour lecture just on Charles Maurice de Talleyrand Périgord. They're all of them very, very significant people in French history and in French writing. Now, Louis Comte de Narbonne-Lara, in fact, he was one of Madame de Stael's many lovers. Her first husband was Monsieur de Stael, who was the Swedish ambassador to France at the time of the Revolution. Her father, you notice the name is Necker, He was the banker, Minister of Finances. He was a Swiss from a place called Coppet. It's still there. And of course, whenever there was trouble, they used to go back across the border into Switzerland. And of course, as you know, there's another town along there called Ferney-Voltaire, where Voltaire was. So she had a beautiful house in the Rue du Bac, and she married Monsieur Necker, who was the Swedish ambassador. And in fact, that was a great thing because she became rather immune to all the attacks on the people during the Terror. And she managed to smuggle a lot of them out using her diplomatic passports. Now, the Comte de Narbonne, if you look at him very carefully, it is said that he was an illegitimate child of Louis XV. Louis XV, he actually had I don't want to shock anybody, but he had his own brothel at the Parc aux Cerfs. And if you've seen things like Les Liaisons Dangereuses, about these young girls who were seduced by these older men, it was basically because they were so afraid of catching something nasty that they wanted, and it's terrible this, uncontaminated young ladies. Well, if they got pregnant, they'd find them a husband, a noble husband, and this is the case of many of them. And so it is probable that the Comte de Narbonne was one of the illegitimate children of Louis XV. In fact, they say he looked like it. Well, anyway, Madame de Stael had 2 children by him. He went on after he returned to France. They all went back in 1800, a lot of them. Some of them went away again. But in 1800, they couldn't go back until 1800 because Napoleon had banned Emigrés coming back who were monarchists. So you didn't want to show that you were a monarchist. But anyway, the Comte de Narbonne, in fact, was a great supporter of Louis XVIII. And in fact, he welcomed him when he came back. Now, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand Périgord was probably the most incredible and most devious, venal person in the whole of France. But in fact, he was there all the time. He never went away. It was a bit like Russia's foreign minister, never went through all the regimes. Anyway, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand Périgord, he actually lived in St. George's Square in London for a short period. But they spent their summer in spent a year or 6 months to a year in Juniper Hall, where they were all philosophizing and discussing what they hoped France would become. The Duc de Laval Montmorency, another one of the people that was part of this group of constitutionalists, he went on to be ambassador various times in his life. He actually was not a great support, although he supported Louis Philippe when he came back. He refused to sign a declaration of supporting him forever, so he went off and retired. And this is La Comtesse de la Chartre, very beautiful lady. She lost her husband, and she married Le Marquis de Jaucourt, another aristocrat who became a diplomat. So they all went back to France. They all actually lived long lives, the people who weren't executed. And then, of course, there's General Alexandre d'Arblay. Now, D'Arblay was a general in the artillery. And again, as you heard me say before, with a man called Attalin, who is Louis XV's aide-de-camp in Twickenham, he also fought with Bonaparte and was with him and supported the new regime. Now, while he was there in Mickleham, he met a lady called Fanny Burney, who became a very well-known novelist, because her sister, Susanna, Fanny Burney was the daughter of a musician. Fanny Burney wrote quite a few well-known novels, and she married the Comte Alexandre Général d'Arblay, and she went back to France in 1800. Unfortunately, after the Peace of Amiens had been breached in 1802, she found herself stuck in France. She couldn't get back. And one of the things that happened to her, She obviously had her children in France, but she actually had a suspected cancer, so she had a mastectomy. And in fact, it's quite horrific. She wrote it all down, no anesthetic, of course, and she describes exactly what happened. So that's quite an interesting thing to read if you were interested. But Fanny Burney, a wonderful lady, another one who lived a long time. Now we come to La Marquise de la Tour du Pin, about whom I've spoken quite a lot. And this is the famous Marquise de la Tour du Pin, who, as I explained to you, was descended from the Earls of Lichfield and the Jerningham family. She got rather fed up with living in the Rosary. It was a bit too cramped, the 2 rooms with herself, her family, and her 2 children, and another one on the way. So she managed to find herself a little cottage. And that, in fact, is, for those who don't know it, is the gatehouse of Old Richmond Palace. And she lived in the cottage next door. The cottage next door was part of the old courthouse, Richmond Green, which is where le Marquis de Thuisy lived. He's the gentleman that found them all the work and looked after their interest. Very nice chap. And the house that she lived in, unfortunately, is masked behind that tree. Well, when I was looking up all these things, I discovered that house it's up for sale if anybody wants to buy it. The lease has only got 6 years to run, and it's 2.5 million. But if you pay another 7.5 million, you can probably get it for another 90 years. They are all Crown property. That's why they're on leases. And it is a very splendid house. So now this is the Prince de Poix. Now his wife, he divorced his wife. She stayed in France. Another man who became a great diplomat, but he was living in England, escaping the terror, which is what they were doing. And as I explained to you, he would often take La Comtesse de la Tour du Pin, whom you know, it's that lady, to see her friend La Duchesse de Duras, who actually married the Duke de Duras when she was in England in 1797. Very interesting writer. They've only discovered recently that she wrote some incredible things. She wrote a book she was anti-slavery, she was a feminist, and in fact it's well worth reading her books. Her family came from Martinique. Possibly that's why she has a slightly swarthy look. And you can see that this is the Tilbury in which they used to ride. What used to happen is Madame de la Tour du Pin would walk from Twickenham to Teddington, Richmond to Teddington. For those people who don't know all these places, this is why I explain where Teddington is. Teddington in Old English means Tide End Town, because that is where the first main lock was. Richmond Lock was only there because there was a barrier which was erected in 1895. They put up the lock bridge, which is where the poor old whale was the other day. And the first real lock was at Teddington, Tide End Town. Now this is Germaine de Stael. As I've told you, she had many lovers, and she was a great writer. And one of her lovers and correspondents was Benjamin Constant, who's famous for a novel called Adolphe. But he was in correspondence with her for many years, and he was also the father of 2 of her children. And this is her younger husband, Jean de Rocca, another brilliant army officer, and who was in the armies of Napoleon as well as in the French army of the old regime. And they lived in this charming place, which actually was built in 1812. And so she was one of the first residents from 1813 to 1814. And that, unfortunately, was by Richmond Bridge on the Richmond side. And it was pulled down in 1936 for road widening. As you can see, it's a bit dilapidated even in that picture. But again, it's one of those lovely houses that were lost. Now we come back to the French royal family about whom I spoke last time. And as you know, in 1848, Louis Philippe left France with his family because he didn't actually want any more rioting. He didn't want people to be shot, so he abdicated. Now, what's interesting is that his son, the Duc de Nemours, who was his second son, gave up his claim to the throne, and the widow that of Ferdinand, who was the Duc d'Orléans, that was the eldest son. This was Helen de Mecklenburg-Schwerin. She actually was she was going to make herself the regent of her 12-year-old son, who became Le Comte de Paris. You've seen some of these people in the last lecture, so I won't go into that too much, but I will basically touch on them. This is Ancaster House, which has been turned into luxury apartments. I discovered this recently at the top of Richmond Hill. So he stayed there when he first arrived back in England in 1848. He was an admiral in the French Navy, and that is his wife, Princess Francisca de Joinville. She was actually Princess Francisca Duarte. She was actually the niece of the King of Portugal, and she was the daughter of the Emperor of Brazil, because as you know, Brazil was a part of the Portuguese Empire. Now, I only discovered in the last few days that the poor Prince de Joinville was deaf, and he had many operations as a boy to no avail. And in fact, his great friend was Victor Hugo, who bemoaned the fact that his poor friend couldn't hear properly. Now, when I was doing my original researches, I discovered that Francesca Françoise never stopped talking, wittering away, very noisy, very excited. But of course, it didn't worry him because he couldn't hear her. There's, of course, as I told you last time, Louis Philippe went to Clermont in Esher because that had been the home given to Charlotte, the princess of daughter of George IV, and her new husband, Leopold, who was Queen Victoria's uncle. And unfortunately, she died. But in fact, Leopold had the house for life, plus a pension. And so that's why, as Leopold's second wife was Marie-Louise of France, that is Louis Philippe's daughter, he allowed his parents-in-law to live in Clermont, obviously with the permission of Queen Victoria. But unfortunately, when they first went there in 1848, they weren't there for long before poor Queen Marie-Amélie became very ill because the drains were terrible and the water was not very good. So they had to evacuate Clermont for everything to be redone. And they lived in the Star and Garter Hotel, Richmond Hill. That is one of the many transformations of the Star and Garter, which of course is now the former home of the wounded soldiers. Started in there in the First World War, the great big chateau-like hotel of Petersham, the Star and Garter on the Richmond Hill, was used as a hospital for wounded soldiers during the First World War. Unfortunately, Richmond had lost its attraction because once the railways came in, people could go further afield than Richmond. Richmond was very, very convenient as a clean air resort just outside London. And when you think how awful the smog was in London, you can imagine why people would escape to Richmond, which was so near. Hence the reason so many of the nobility had homes in Petersham and Richmond. So there's Louis Philippe, and when they moved back into Clermont, he died in 1850. Now, this is Duchess d'Orléans, Hélène of Mecklenburg-Schwerin. She was, in fact, a Protestant princess, and I think when I gave you the lecture last time, I showed you the mausoleum in Dreux, which was actually started by Louis Philippe's mother, la Duchesse de Penthièvre. And in fact, when she got married, the Archbishop of of Paris would not allow them to be married in Notre Dame because she was Protestant. So I think the people from Fontainebleau will back me up on this. They got married in Fontainebleau, in the chapel in Fontainebleau, because they weren't allowed to be married because of her being a Protestant in the Notre Dame. Well, after the government refused to let her be the regent of Le Comte de Paris, whom you've seen before, she moved back from Germany, where she'd gone for a short while. After having resided for a few months in Esher, not in the house, in another house, Sandown House, she moved to this house for the last years of her life. And this is Northumberland House, which was by the river, and it was only pulled down in 1961 to widen the road, Petersham Road. So anybody who's about my age will possibly remember this house in their youth. Anyway, there is the Duchesse d'Orléans, Helen of Mecklenburg-Schwerin. Apparently she wasn't the world's most attractive lady, but she did in fact bear Louis Philippe's son Ferdinand 2 sons. And she died, unfortunately, in 1858. She caught flu, and her son Robert Duc de Chartres also caught the flu. There are theories that he gave her the flu, but anyway, she died of influenza in 1858 in that house. After that, he went back to live with his grandmother and the rest of the family in Claremont in Esher. Now, you might say to me, why on earth is he wearing an American uniform? Well, his uncle, the Prince de Joinville, who was a very, very, very clever military tactician, who was an admiral, but he also knew an awful lot about military affairs. They were very, very bright, as I explained to you. All of Louis Philippe's sons were educated in the Lycée Henri IV, which is near the Panthéon in Paris. And as a matter of fact, no discrimination, they all passed the baccalaureate with the highest marks. They were very, very clever people. And they had, of course, they had their fantastic father, who'd been educated by Madame de Genlis, about whom you heard last time. So there was this great desire for learning and for study. Anyway, there is the Robert Duc de Chartres, who was born in 1840 in Paris. So in 1858, he was only 18. And she died in 1858. And in 1861, the Prince de Joinville, with his own son, the Duc de Penthièvre, who was only a boy of 17, who was educated at home in Ham, in Morgan House, about which I will speak in a minute, he went over to America, offering the services of his 2 nephews, the Comte de Paris and the Duc de Chartres. Comte de Paris was 22, and his brother, the Duc de Chartres, was 20 when they went to America in 1860, 1861. And it's very interesting, the picture, it isn't a real color picture, it's one that was colored in, which I discovered, which I think is really good because it does exactly show you what they really looked like. And there is the Prince de Joinville, and I know that the picture of the Prince de Joinville was taken in a studio in New York in 1862. Well, if you look carefully, it's the same floor, so it's the same studio. So all of those 3, Prince de Joinville, Comte de Paris, and Duc de Chartres, were photographed in a studio in New York. Now, he was very, very great tactician, the Prince de Joinville, very, very helpful to McClellan. He'd actually offered his services to Lincoln, because, as you know, they were great. They believed in constitutional monarchies. They believed in the abolition of slavery. And so that's why they went and fought on the northern side, whereas you would have thought automatically they would have all fought on the southern side, because a lot of French aristocrats, some of whom you've already seen, like Narbonne, they took part in the wars to get the southern states away from the British. So So and that's hence the reason it's Nouvelle-Orléans and Louisiane, and obviously after, because it was all French colonies originally. Anyway, there's the Duc de Penthièvre, who was educated at home in Ham, and then he went to study higher education in Edinburgh. And then, of course, he decided he wanted to be in the Navy like his father. And so he decided he wanted to do his studies in America. And that's the reason that all of them went over to the States. Reason that they left in 1862 was because of the Mexican problem. Two things. Napoleon III was backing the Emperor Maximilian, who was from Austria. He was part of the Habsburgs, and he was in fact put in charge of Mexico. And of course, as you know, he was shot. So there was a bit of a problem with particularly when the Americans started getting involved in the Mexican campaign of 1862, because the Southerners were trying to take over Mexico because of the gold. Anyway, that's the reason why they left in 1862. They didn't really want to upset the French opinion, because they all hoped eventually to come back to France. This is Morgan House, Ham, where the Robert Duc de Chartres. Now, interestingly enough, all of them at some time served in the French army of Napoleon. After Napoleon the Third left, the Robert de Chartres was helping with the unification of Italy, and he was also in the French army fighting the Prussians, and that's why he has uniforms. But unfortunately, in 1886, because of the Comte Louis-Philippe Albert, that's the Comte de Paris. The Comte de Paris' daughter, Marie-Amélie, taking the same name as her grandmother, married the future King of Portugal, and that started in 1886 riots in Paris, which were pro-monarchist riots, demonstrations. So in fact, in 1886, the French government asked them all to leave. So they all came back to England, or in the case of the Duc de Montpensier, he stayed in Spain. In fact, the Comte de Paris, this is Comte Robert, married his cousin, the Comtesse de Paris, who was the Infanta of Spain, because her father married a Spanish princess. And they stayed, as I told you before last time, in Sheen House, Sheen Lane, from 1886 until 1890. And then for the last 4 years of his life, he lived in Stowe. And now we're coming near to the end. This is the Vineyard Passage about which I spoke, where many of these aristocrats are buried. And there you see, in memory of Louisa Frances Gabrielle d'Alsace-Chimay, Vicomtesse de Combis. She was the niece of the Comte de Boufflers, born princess of the, it says, of the empire. No, that they got that wrong, because the empire didn't exist at that time. She wasn't born a princess of the empire, because the empire didn't come in until 1800. But she died in 1809, and she's buried in the Vineyard Passage. I remember when we had a campaign to clean up all those graves, which prompted me to be asked to write the first article about this very subject. And that is the end of the lecture. I hope that you enjoyed it.